People often mistake silence for surrender, assuming you are just a broken loser giving up. In my world, silence is simply the time required to reload. When my brother smirked across that freezing Seattle courtroom, mocking my lack of counsel, he thought he was walking into an easy inheritance trial. He had no idea he was stepping into a flawless trap. He thought I was empty-handed, but the most devastating punishments are always invisible. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. My name is Brooklyn Munoz. I am 34 years old, born and raised under the perpetual, weeping gray clouds of Seattle, Washington. For as long as my memory serves, I was never the protagonist in my own childhood home. I existed merely as background noise, a pale and forgettable shadow constantly eclipsed by the blinding, artificial light of my older brother, Marcus. Marcus was the undisputed golden boy to our mother, Helena. The sun practically rose and set on his command. It never seemed to matter that his grand visions were built entirely on sand. Throughout his 20s and into his 30s, Marcus launched a never-ending series of delusional tech startups. Every single one of them was supposedly the next revolutionary application, the platform that would change modern living, and every single one inevitably crashed into spectacular, humiliating bankruptcy. Yet, whenever his house of cards collapsed, our mother was right there, sweeping up the messy pieces. She continuously drained her hard-earned life savings, cashing out retirement accounts just to bail him out. She happily funded his expensive lifestyle, his leased European sports cars, and his empty promises, completely convinced that he was simply a misunderstood genius waiting for his big break. My reality, on the other hand, was starkly different. While Marcus carelessly burned through thousands of dollars of our mother's money, I quietly worked 2 part-time jobs just to keep my head above water. Every straight-A report card I brought home, every academic scholarship I won, every quiet milestone of my fierce independence was met with a polite, distracted nod before the conversation was swiftly pivoted back to Marcus and his latest pitch deck. Mother viewed my self-reliance not as an achievement to be celebrated, but as a dull, expected baseline. She frequently called me too pragmatic, too rigidly grounded, stating that I fundamentally lacked the visionary ambition that my brother possessed in spades. In her heavily biased eyes, my quiet discipline was undeniable proof of a cold heart and a profoundly mediocre future. To her, I was just the reliable, boring daughter who would never amount to anything spectacular. I learned at a very young age that screaming for validation in a room where everyone is purposefully deaf to your voice is a massive waste of breath. So, I stopped trying altogether. I packed my belongings into a cheap duffel bag and moved out the very morning I turned 18. I paid my own university tuition by working exhausting graveyard shifts and studying in the freezing hours of the dawn. Piece by piece, year by year, I meticulously severed the emotional strings that tied me to the heavy illusion of a perfect, loving family. I stopped craving my mother's warmth because I finally understood she had absolutely none left in her reserves for me. The single frayed rope that kept me tethered to the concept of family was my maternal aunt, Eleanor. She was a retired real estate tycoon forged from pure, unyielding steel. Eleanor was the absolute antithesis of my mother. She had built a massive property empire from scratch, navigating the cutthroat commercial markets of the Pacific Northwest without a shred of pity for fools. More importantly, she was the only living person in our bloodline completely immune to my brother's charm. She saw right through his tailored Italian suits and his hollow corporate buzzwords, recognizing him instantly for exactly what he was: a charismatic parasite. I will never forget a fateful conversation we had 12 years ago. I was exactly 22 years old, sitting across from her in her mahogany-lined study. The grand fireplace cast long, flickering shadows across the heavy bookshelves as she poured us both a glass of dark red wine. She looked at me, her eyes sharp, analytical, and piercing. "Brooklyn," Aunt Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a low, commanding register that demanded absolute silence. "Do not let their dismissal of you breed useless resentment. Let it breed strategy. People like your mother and your brother are completely blinded by their own arrogance. They look at you and see nothing, which means they will never see you coming. The arrogance of others is always their largest blind spot." She leaned forward, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against the edge of her heavy oak desk. "Do not fight them in the light where they can perform for an audience and play the victim. Build your power in the dark. Let them think you are exactly what they want you to be, harmless." That night, the bitter, unloved younger sister died. Someone entirely new took her place. I took Eleanor's ruthless wisdom and carved it deeply into my bones. I fully embraced the shadows they forced me into, completely unaware that the dark was the most perfect environment to quietly grow an empire. I was recruited by Aegis Vanguard Analytics exactly 3 weeks after my college graduation. To the casual observer, Aegis sounded like a painfully sterile corporate entity, an endless maze of gray cubicles where uninspired accountants went to slowly die of boredom. I actively nurtured that exact misconception. Whenever a rare, painfully forced holiday dinner required my presence, I would describe my role as a mid-level data entry clerk. I fed my family a carefully rehearsed, excruciatingly dull narrative filled with complaints about spreadsheet formatting, paper jams, and meaningless administrative tasks. It was the absolute perfect camouflage. Being deliberately pathetic was a brilliant tactical defense. It guaranteed that my mother's eyes would instantly glaze over, prompting her to steer the conversation back to Marcus. Most crucially, it ensured my brother would never look at me and see a potential bailout fund. I was practically invisible, which was exactly where I needed to be. The reality of my existence was buried behind triple-layered biometric security protocols, heavily encrypted offshore servers, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Aegis Vanguard was not a boring accounting firm. It was an elite, fiercely guarded intelligence syndicate specializing in severe cybersecurity threat assessments and high-level forensic financial investigations. We were the people corporations called when millions vanished into thin air. Over a span of 10 grueling years, I tore through the ranks. I spent thousands of hours shredding through complex algorithms, piercing corporate veils, and untangling elaborate webs of offshore shell companies. By my early 30s, I had earned the title of Forensic Financial Director. I was a predator in the digital realm. I spent my days tracking the invisible flow of dirty money, breaking down massive multinational fraud syndicates, and handing devastating, irrefutable evidence directly over to federal agencies. I mapped the hidden, cancerous veins of corruption pulsing beneath the polished surface of modern capitalism. I was the silent architect of ruin for white-collar criminals, operating entirely in the dark, only revealing myself when the trap had already snapped shut. During that same 10-year span, the bond between Aunt Eleanor and myself evolved into an impenetrable fortress. We ceased being merely an aunt and her niece. We became a general and her chief intelligence officer. My highly specialized skill set served as an invisible, impenetrable shield surrounding her vast real estate empire. While she ruthlessly dominated boardrooms and crushed competitors in the daylight, I quietly audited her general contractors, ran deep-dive forensic background checks on her prospective business partners, and aggressively safeguarded her liquid assets from the shadows. I personally intercepted and dismantled 3 separate, highly sophisticated embezzlement attempts before the perpetrators could siphon a single dollar from her accounts. We were a terrifyingly efficient, unspoken force. She brought the capital and the reputation, and I brought the absolute certainty that no one could ever steal from her without facing catastrophic consequences. However, while my hidden empire steadily expanded, my brother was actively driving his own life off a cliff. Marcus had desperately entangled himself in a disastrous, high-yield leverage scheme with a notoriously shady, unlicensed investment broker operating out of a decaying strip mall. He was drowning in a sea of toxic, high-interest debt, bleeding cash at a terrifying velocity. The people he owed money to were not the type to send polite collection letters. Panic finally fractured his usual smug demeanor. My mother, completely frantic and desperate to maintain the fragile, decaying illusion of the Munoz family prestige, turned her sights on the absolute last remaining target. She aggressively ambushed Aunt Eleanor. Helena demanded an immediate, massive injection of capital to save her golden boy from impending legal disaster and potential physical harm. She practically ordered Eleanor to liquidate a portion of her portfolio, declaring it her absolute blood duty to save the family honor. Eleanor did not even blink. She sat rigidly in her heavy leather armchair, her face a mask of pure stone, and delivered a flat, utterly uncompromising rejection. "I will not burn down my life's work to keep your delusion warm. Helena," Eleanor had stated, her voice slicing through the room like a frozen blade. "Your son is a parasite. He built a ship out of rotten wood, and now it is taking on water. If he sinks, let him drown. I will not hand over a single cent." My mother erupted into a hysterical, ugly rage. She screamed, hurled vicious insults, and formally disowned her own sister right there in the grand foyer, strictly forbidding any of us from ever speaking the name Eleanor again. It was a spectacular, pathetic display of toxic entitlement. I, naturally, ignored my mother's hysterical mandate completely and maintained my secure, encrypted lines of communication with my aunt. But our formidable partnership was violently cut short, just 4 months after that explosive family confrontation. Aunt Eleanor suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. The shockwave of her sudden, permanent absence hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She left behind an agonizing, unfillable void in my life, taking away the only piece of my bloodline I genuinely respected. But as the dust settled, I realized she had also left behind something else. She left behind a sprawling, fiercely contested fortune and a blood-soaked legal battlefield primed for absolute war. The reading of the will took place in a sterile downtown law office on a rainy Tuesday morning. Marcus and my mother arrived radiating a sickening sense of premature victory. They strutted into the mahogany conference room as if they were royalty reclaiming a stolen throne. They had clearly spent the entire weekend doing the math. Aunt Eleanor's estate was valued at roughly $40 million. In their greedy, twisted minds, since my mother was the only surviving sibling and Marcus the obvious heir apparent. That staggering fortune was already sitting comfortably in their bank accounts. My mother even wore a brand new designer black dress, a deeply hypocritical display of mourning bought on credit, while Marcus wore a custom-tailored suit that he absolutely could not afford. The stench of their desperate anticipation was suffocating. The executing attorney, a tired-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and began reading the binding legal documents. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with a smug, expectant grin, completely ready to become a multimillionaire. Then, the attorney dropped the guillotine. He read the distribution of assets clearly and deliberately, leaving no room for misinterpretation. 100% of the corporate shares. Every single piece of commercial real estate located in the downtown district, all private trust funds and offshore investment accounts. Everything was legally and irreversibly transferred to me. The attorney then read a specific, brutal clause Aunt Eleanor had drafted. It explicitly stated that my mother and my brother were purposefully excluded from the will, left with absolutely nothing, not a single penny. The silence that followed was heavy and violent. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Then, the explosion came. Marcus violently slammed both of his fists onto the heavy glass table, shaking the entire room and rattling the coffee mugs. His face twisted into an ugly crimson mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He grabbed a thick stack of legal copies and hurled them directly at my chest, the heavy papers scattering wildly across the floor. "You scheming little rat," he spat, his voice trembling with a venom so pure it was almost impressive. "You manipulated her." My mother collapsed back into her chair, unleashing a theatrical, piercing wail that echoed down the hallway. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face contorted with absolute hatred. "You cold-blooded snake. You manipulated a sick, senile old woman in her final days. You isolated my sister from her real family to steal her legacy. I swear on my life, you will not get away with this. I will see you in a prison cell." I sat completely motionless, letting their pathetic tantrum wash over me without changing my expression or breaking eye contact. I did not defend myself. I did not utter a single word. I simply stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my cheap coat, and walked out of the room. Within 48 hours, they had weaponized their fury. Desperate people do desperate things, and my family was drowning in toxic debt. They pooled whatever heavily borrowed resources they had left and hired Victor Thorne. Thorne was a notoriously vicious litigator specializing in contested inheritance cases. He was not just a lawyer, he was a highly paid mercenary. He had built his entire terrifying career on ruthless character assassination. His signature strategy involved utilizing aggressive smear tactics to publicly destroy his opponents, leaking damaging personal information, and dragging families through the mud in open court until the opposition was practically begging for a settlement out of pure shame and emotional exhaustion. Hiring him was an explicit declaration of total war. They wanted to humiliate me and break my spirit before we even stepped before a judge. That very same night, my phone vibrated with a text message from Marcus. "You think you are so smart when we get to court. I am going to strip you of everything you own. You are finished." They expected me to panic. They fully anticipated that I would scramble in terror, draining my modest savings to hire a defense attorney just to survive Thorne's brutal onslaught. Instead, I did the exact opposite. I knew that involving outside legal counsel meant relinquishing control over the evidence, and I needed absolute control over the flow of information to protect my real identity. I walked into the county courthouse and officially filed the paperwork to represent myself. I submitted a formal declaration of pro se representation. The moment that public filing hit the docket, word immediately reached my family's legal team. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Marcus and my mother actually popped an expensive bottle of champagne to celebrate the news. To them, my lack of legal counsel was the ultimate, undeniable proof of my sheer desperation. They assumed my fictitious data entry clerk's salary meant I simply could not afford to fight back against a legal titan. They firmly believed I was terrified, completely outgunned, and blindly walking straight into a slaughterhouse. They thought the $40 million was finally secured. They were completely unaware that my silence was not a surrender, but the sound of an inescapable trap snapping shut. The trial commenced on a crisp, overcast Monday morning at the State Supreme Court building in downtown Seattle. The courtroom was a cavernous, intimidating chamber of dark mahogany and polished marble, designed specifically to make a person feel incredibly small. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early, taking my seat at the defense table entirely alone. I arranged a single, inexpensive legal pad and a cheap black pen on the desk in front of me, just before the bailiff called the room to order. The heavy double doors swung open, and the Munoz entourage made their grand theatrical entrance. Marcus practically strutted down the central aisle. He was draped in an immaculately tailored, midnight blue designer suit, looking every inch the wealthy tech visionary he desperately pretended to be. My mother trailed closely behind him, clutching a highly visible, tear-soaked tissue to play the part of the grieving, wronged matriarch. As Marcus walked past my lonely defense table, he slowed his pace just enough to lean down. His expensive cologne masked the faint scent of his underlying financial panic. "No lawyer," he whispered, a nasty, victorious smirk twisting his lips. "You are finished." I did not grace him with a response. I simply looked forward. The Honorable Judge Harrison, an older gentleman with a stern face and a reputation for absolute zero tolerance in his courtroom, took the bench. The moment the wooden gavel struck, Victor Thorne took the floor. I had to admit, observing Thorne in his natural habitat was like watching a highly trained apex predator. He possessed a formidable, undeniable stage presence. He paced gracefully in front of the jury box, his voice dripping with perfectly calibrated, manufactured empathy. Thorne dedicated the entirety of day one to painting a horrifying, tragic masterpiece. He meticulously crafted a narrative of a bitter, deeply unsuccessful younger sister. He stood before the court and described me as a lowly, unambitious data entry clerk who had spent her entire adult life simmering in toxic jealousy over her older brother's brilliant entrepreneurial spirit. According to Thorne's dramatic opening statement, my profound lack of personal achievement drove me to commit the ultimate betrayal. He claimed I had spent the final months of Aunt Eleanor's life operating as a shadowy manipulator, exploiting a vulnerable, declining elderly woman, poisoning her mind against her true, loving family just to secure an unearned payday. To reinforce this complete fabrication, Thorne paraded a carefully selected string of character witnesses up to the stand. These were individuals clearly bought and paid for, reciting heavily rehearsed scripts. A former private caregiver, who had conveniently been fired by my aunt just 6 months prior for stealing prescription medication, testified under oath that I routinely screened all incoming phone calls. She fabricated wild, emotional stories about me physically blocking the doorway whenever my mother or Marcus attempted to visit, claiming I kept my aunt locked in a state of terrified isolation. It was an absolutely stunning, award-winning performance of perjury. Throughout this brutal, hours-long character assassination, the courtroom atmosphere grew thick with judgment. From the gallery, I could feel my mother's eyes burning into the back of my neck, her face glowing with raw, unrestrained gloating. Judge Harrison frequently glanced down at me from his high bench, his expression shifting from stern impartiality to genuine, profound pity. I looked completely defenseless. I was a lone woman in a cheap sweater, being systemically torn to shreds by a high-priced legal machine. Midway through the afternoon session, the judge actually paused the proceedings. He leaned forward, adjusting his heavy spectacles, and looked at me with deep concern. "Ms. Munoz," Judge Harrison said gently, "I must advise you again. The plaintiff is presenting a highly aggressive case. Are you absolutely certain you do not wish to request a recess to secure professional legal counsel to protect your interests?" I looked up at him, offered a soft, polite smile, and gently shook my head. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I am perfectly fine," I replied calmly. I went right back to making quiet notations in my small notebook. I did not raise a single objection all day. I let Thorne lead his corrupt witnesses. I let him submit his falsified timelines. I let the arrogant, intoxicating thrill of their impending victory flood their minds. I handed them every tool they needed to engineer their own absolute downfall. When the bailiff finally dismissed the court for the evening, the air in the room was practically buzzing with my family's premature triumph. I packed my single notebook into my bag and walked out into the echoing marble corridor. Before I could reach the heavy exit doors, a thick arm firmly grasped the doorframe in front of me, blocking my path. It was Victor Thorne. He had unbuttoned his suit jacket, radiating the relaxed, magnanimous confidence of a hunter who had just successfully cornered his bleeding prey. "Listen to me very carefully," Thorne said, his voice a low, condescending rumble. "You took an absolute beating in there today. Tomorrow is going to be significantly worse. The judge pities you. The gallery despises you. And frankly, I am tired of wasting my valuable time swatting a fly. My clients are feeling incredibly generous. They are willing to offer you 10% of the estate's liquid assets right now. You sign the withdrawal papers tonight. You walk away with a few $1,000,000, and you avoid the total public destruction of your life tomorrow morning." I looked at the crisp settlement document in his outstretched hand, then slowly raised my head to meet his cold, calculating eyes. "I appreciate your concern for my well-being, Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "But I think I would like to see what tomorrow brings." I stepped around him, pushed open the heavy doors, and walked away into the freezing Seattle rain, leaving him standing alone in the hallway, completely oblivious to the massive avalanche hovering just above his head. The trial resumed on a damp as gray Tuesday morning. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open precisely at 9 o'clock. Marcus strolled down the center aisle, sporting a brand new charcoal gray suit, radiating the exact same unearned confidence he had paraded the previous afternoon. He leaned over to my mother, whispering a joke that made her chuckle softly behind her manicured hand. Victor Thorne was already standing at the plaintiff's table, aggressively organizing his legal pads and straightening his expensive silk tie, fully preparing to deliver the final, lethal blow to my character. However, the moment Judge Harrison entered the chamber, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted violently. The temperature seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. He did not offer the gallery his usual polite morning greeting. He did not ask the bailiff to read the docket number. His face was carved from solid, unforgiving granite. In his right hand, he carried a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. Across the front of that envelope, stamped in stark, glaring red ink, was the official seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Judge Harrison took his seat at the high bench and set the heavy envelope down with a loud, resounding thud that echoed sharply across the quiet room. He ignored his daily itinerary. Instead, he looked directly past me and locked his piercing, stern gaze entirely onto my brother's legal counsel. "Attorney Thorne," the judge began, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "Before we proceed any further, I need you to answer a very simple question. Are you absolutely certain your clients understand the actual identity of the defendant they have dragged into my courtroom?" Thorne paused, his hands freezing over his neatly stacked notes. A brief flicker of genuine confusion crossed his polished features, but his massive ego quickly swallowed it down. He buttoned his suit jacket, stood tall, and stepped up to the wooden podium. "Your Honor, we are fully aware of who Ms. Munoz is." Thorne answered, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. "She is a low-level administrative clerk acting as a hostile, manipulative executor of the estate in question. We established her lack of professional standing and financial desperation quite clearly yesterday." Judge Harrison let out a harsh, utterly humorless breath. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a silver letter opener, and deliberately sliced through the thick red wax seal of the envelope. "That is a truly fascinating narrative, Mr. Thorne," the judge stated loudly, his eyes scanning the top page of the file. "Because late last night, I received a supplementary, highly classified subpoena regarding this exact docket number. I am currently looking at a deeply protected personnel file sent directly to my chambers by federal authorities." The judge adjusted his heavy spectacles, leaning forward so his voice would carry into every single corner of the sprawling room. "Let the court record reflect the true, verified occupational title of the defendant. Brooklyn Munoz is not an administrative data entry clerk. She is a senior forensic financial investigator operating at the highest executive tier of Aegis Vanguard Analytics. Furthermore, she holds active Tier 1 special audit authority for multiple ongoing federal investigations involving the Department of Justice and the United States Securities and Exchange Commission." Total chaos erupted. The gallery broke into a frantic, chaotic wave of aggressive whispering. Reporters sitting in the back rows frantically began scribbling in their notepads, sensing a massive story unfolding. My mother's mouth dropped wide open in sheer, unadulterated horror, her carefully practiced grieving widow persona completely shattering. Marcus completely froze in his expensive leather chair. The arrogant, nasty smirk was wiped from his face so fast it looked as though he had been violently struck. He stared at me, his eyes wide and panicked, desperately trying to reconcile the pathetic sister he had mocked yesterday with the federal predator standing in front of him today. Victor Thorne's survival instincts instantly kicked into overdrive. He violently slammed his open palm onto the podium, trying to reclaim control of the collapsing narrative. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an absolute circus," Thorne shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "The defendant's hidden career, while perhaps interesting for a resume, is entirely irrelevant to the probate matter at hand. This is a simple, straightforward civil dispute over a heavily manipulated last will and testament." That was my cue. After 24 hours of absolute, unbroken silence, I finally moved. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my tailored jacket, reached down to my leather briefcase, and pulled out a massive, heavy binder tightly bound with black steel clips. I stepped out from behind the defense table and walked slowly toward the center of the room. The entire courtroom fell dead silent, the collective breath of the crowd hitching as they waited for my very first words of the trial. "The reason I did not hire a defense attorney to represent me," I stated, my voice ringing out crystal clear, chilling, and completely devoid of mercy, "is because this is no longer a civil property dispute. You are not presiding over a simple probate hearing. Your Honor, you are currently standing directly in the center of an active crime scene for a multi-million-dollar financial fraud and a highly coordinated money laundering operation." I walked directly to the bench and handed the heavy binder to the court clerk. "I am formally submitting into evidence a fully certified, federally sanctioned forensic audit," I declared loudly, staring directly at my brother. "It is a complete, irrefutable tracing of my brother's recent financial history, meticulously cross-referenced with the last 6 months of my late aunt's banking activities." Thorne's face turned an ugly, furious shade of magenta. He marched aggressively toward me, pointing a shaking finger. "Your Honor, I demand a copy of those documents immediately. The defense cannot simply ambush this court with unverified, wild financial claims without providing discovery to the plaintiff." I turned to Thorne, offering him a slow, perfectly calculated smile that contained absolutely no warmth. "Of course, Mr. Thorne," I replied softly. "I would never deny you the opportunity to read your own future. The clerk has a copy prepared specifically for your immediate review." The clerk handed Thorne an identical thick stack of freshly printed paper. Thorne snatched it aggressively from her hands, his chest heaving with arrogant indignation. He flipped open the cover page, fully intending to loudly mock whatever numbers I had compiled. He read the first paragraph. He blinked hard, as if his eyes were deceiving him, and quickly scanned down to the second paragraph. Then, he frantically turned to the third page, where a series of highly detailed banking transit numbers were highlighted in bright, blinding yellow ink. The transformation was instantaneous, brutal, and utterly terrifying to witness. The aggressive, towering legal titan completely vanished into thin air. Every single drop of blood rapidly drained from Victor Thorne's face, leaving his skin the color of wet, dirty ash. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening slightly, but no sound managed to escape his throat. The crisp white pages tightly gripped in his hands began to tremble. Within mere seconds, that slight tremble escalated into a violent, uncontrollable shake, the heavy paper loudly and rhythmically rustling against the solid oak wood of the podium as his entire world began to violently collapse around him. The heavy binder in Victor Thorne's trembling hands was not merely a collection of employment records, it was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. A lethal, undeniable weapon forged from thousands of lines of raw data that I had personally compiled over the past 3 weeks, page after page. The report detailed a highly sophisticated trail of digital breadcrumbs. It explicitly proved that exactly 2 months before Aunt Eleanor suffered her fatal heart attack, Marcus had successfully forged her signature on multiple legal documents. He had unlawfully leveraged a massive commercial property in the downtown district, securing a massive, high-interest mortgage to desperately cover his failing, toxic debts. But that was not the twist that caused a seasoned, ruthless litigator to lose his breath. The true devastating kill shot was buried deep on page 42. The meticulous routing numbers highlighted in bright yellow ink proved exactly where those stolen, fraudulent funds had been deposited. Marcus had not moved the money into his own personal checking account. He knew that would trigger an immediate, glaring audit from the bank. Instead, desperately trying to hide his tracks, he had wired the entire sum of the stolen money directly into the heavily protected escrow account of his own legal counsel. He had used Victor Thorne's prestigious law firm as an unwitting offshore laundry machine. By accepting Marcus as a client and utilizing those exact stolen funds to formally retain his services and pay his exorbitant legal fees, Thorne had unknowingly absorbed stolen federal assets into his own corporate infrastructure. He was now, in the strict eyes of the United States federal government, a direct accessory to wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. Thorne, a man who had spent 30 years destroying lives in a courtroom, instantly understood that his entire existence had just evaporated. The color completely vanished from his skin. The heavy stack of documents slipped from his shaking fingers, hitting the marble floor with a loud, chaotic slap that echoed off the high ceiling. "I had no idea," Thorne stammered, his polished, commanding voice completely reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. "I had absolutely no knowledge of the origin of these funds." He physically stumbled backward, tripping over his own expensive leather chair. He scrambled away from Marcus as if my brother were suddenly radiating a deadly, contagious disease. Marcus shot up from his seat, raw panic completely consuming his features. He whipped his head around, desperately searching for an exit, but the heavy courtroom doors were already secured by armed guards. He turned toward our mother, his eyes pleading, begging her for one more bailout, one more desperate rescue from the consequences of his own actions. But Helena was completely broken. The grand illusion she had aggressively protected for over 3 decades had just violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She sat frozen in her chair, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring in absolute horrified shock at the monumental scale of her golden boy's criminality. The reality of his federal crimes hit her like a physical blow. She suddenly gasped for air, clutching her chest tightly as her knees buckled, collapsing heavily against the wooden railing of the gallery. For the very first time in her entire life, she had absolutely no excuses left to offer him. Judge Harrison slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, the sound cracking like a rifle shot across the panicked room. "This civil proceeding is immediately suspended," the judge roared, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. "Bailiff, you will place the plaintiff in immediate custody and lock down this courtroom. I am contacting the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now." Nobody moves. 2 armed court officers instantly flanked Marcus. They grabbed his arms, violently twisting them behind his back, and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany table he had been smirking behind just 20 minutes prior. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing through the room was the loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The gallery erupted into total, unrestrained bedlam. Reporters were shouting. My mother was sobbing hysterically, and Marcus was screaming, begging for a lawyer who was currently too busy having a severe panic attack to answer him. Amidst the absolute chaos, the screaming, and the total destruction of the Munoz family name, I simply stood at my defense table. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I was perfectly, peacefully silent. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of serenity wash over my entire soul. I finally understood the lesson Aunt Eleanor had taught me all those years ago in her dark, quiet study. The most perfect, devastating revenge never requires you to scream to prove you are right. It does not require you to lower yourself to their level or fight them in the mud. True power is having the absolute patience to stand perfectly still in the shadows, waiting quietly while your enemies use their own blinding arrogance and sheer stupidity to dig a grave they can never, ever climb out of. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.